So Isaiah, whenever we look at what it is, Isaiah is considered a prophetic book. And he's considered one of the major prophets in the Old Testament. And we'll talk about what a prophet is, but our Bible, I want you to begin to think about your Bible as not a single book. I want you to begin to think about it as a library that you hold in your hands, because that's really what it is. It's a library of poetry. It's a library of history, of New Testament, all letters, all of these things are within like a library that we hold in our hands. And it just happens to be, we call it a book, but it's literally a library of a lot of different information. And so tonight, what we're going to begin doing is working through the book of Isaiah. But before we can go through Isaiah, what we're going to have to actually do is we're going to have to work through how do we get into Isaiah? And so we're going to talk about what does it take for us to get there from an Isaiah standpoint, and actually open the book for the first time and be able to read the very first sentence. A lot of this comes from a gentleman by the name of Eric Tully, who I've been studying with for quite some time now. And then Dr. Tim Mackey, of course, who we've obviously worked with for quite a while and read a bunch of his resources. And then also a lot of the language is coming from the Lexham English Bible. I wanted to make sure from a copyright standpoint that was taken care of. But we're going to go through these four primary things tonight. And so as we look at the first one, what we have to do is set in our mind history. And so none of this will make sense. Isaiah 1 will not make sense if you do not understand the history of how we got to where we are. And the history of Isaiah 1 is this. During this time period, which is in essentially about 700 series BC before Christ, what's happened is the world has gone through, the world of the Jewish people at that time was going through a significant change again. What had happened is we are at the time period to where we've seen King David come along, King Solomon has come along, the kingdom has been divided after Solomon, and we have essentially two kingdoms that have been formed, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom has been primarily made up of the Benjamites and the tribe of Judah. So those two tribes are occupying what we know as Jerusalem. And then the northern part of Israel, the northern tribes, whose capital became Samaria, is occupied by predominantly the 10 remaining tribes out of the family, the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Dan, the Naphtali, the other tribes that exist from the tribe of from Jacob. Y'all follow me? We studied Exodus together. We know where these tribes come from. And so we are at a period after the time of David, after the time of Solomon, and we're at a time that there's a fracture in the kingdom, and Assyria is a massive empire that exists over on the east. And Assyria is at this point beginning to take over and beginning to go through a land conquering campaign. And so they are moving through the land and creating vassal kingdoms that are then providing tribute through taxes back to Assyria to fund the nation. I'm freezing to death. Yeah, I know it's not warm for some reason. That fan is just blowing and I'm freezing. No, that's okay. And so Assyria is moving through a military campaign, and they are conquering all kinds of people, and they pretty much take over the northern kingdom. They rule the northern kingdom almost exclusively at this point. The tribe of Judah is primarily the only surviving tribe, and Judah is where we see the modern day Jewish people come from a historical standpoint, okay? Now, yes, there are still Jews that are from the tribe of the Reuben and Dan and all of those, but when we think about Judaism, it comes from the tribe of Judah, is how we typically think about that. So here's the map of what's happening. If you look right down in here, this is what we are seeing as modern day Israel and the coastline that we often in our minds associate with it. You see the sea here, the Dead Sea, the river, and the Sea of Galilee. So this is what we think of as modern day Jerusalem in this area, and this is where the divided kingdom was that we were talking about. Now, I need to tell you a story, and I want you to follow along with me in 2 Kings chapter 17. 2 Kings chapter 17 gives us the background to where we come to with Isaiah. Are y'all able to follow online? Is the presentation okay? Okay. I just want to make sure you can read it on your phones if you're not reading up here. In the 12th year of Ahaz, the king of Judah, Oshaya, the son of Elah, began to reign over Israel in Samaria. Okay, so you got the main character. Ahaz, the king of Judah, Oshaya, the son of Elah, began to reign over Israel in Samaria. So Oshaya is the one that we are going to focus on tonight. He's our main character, okay? Keep track of him. Oshaya did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, only not as the kings of Israel who were before him, meaning that the kings of Israel were already doing evil before Oshaya showed up on the scene, okay? Oshaya actually comes to power through an assassination. It's a fascinating story, what happens here. But what happens is Israel has begun to degrade into the cultures of the people that it took over. Do y'all remember in Exodus, what did he tell them to do whenever they conquered these people? And why did he tell them to do that? Tell them to tear down their statues and their idols from the high places and he gave them the 10 commandments on top of the Mount Sinai. And why did he do that? Because he was having to retrain them from being in captivity for 400 years in Egypt and worshiping Egyptian gods to worshiping him. And so God put a set of structures in place on Mount Sinai through that marriage covenant that we studied. And as a result of that, one of the primary things he said is that there will be no other God before you. Do you remember that? And so over and over again throughout, if you remember, the 10 commandments are actually separated into primarily commandments associated with your relationship with God and your relationship associated with humanity. Remember that? There's a little bit of Exodus mixed in here on purpose, because that brings us to this time period where we're seeing that Israel has devolved into idol worship. The very thing that God said, do not do this, within 14 or so generations, they convert back into idol worship, just like he brought them out of Egypt with. So that should be in your mind, is that you see this and you say, he did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, not as much as the other kings did, but he was still evil. Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, came up against him. You see the primary kingdom, Assyria, and the king of Assyria comes up against Oshaya, and Oshaya became his vassal and paid tribute to him. So Shalmaneser travels out of Assyria with his army and comes up and takes over the kingdom of the northern tribe where Oshaya is the king of, and he subjects him to actually paying taxes. That goes on for 9 years until Oshaya revolts. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Oshaya, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt. Who had sent messengers? Oshaya. So Oshaya, after a few years of being under the taxations of Assyria and the command of Assyria, said, I don't want it anymore. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the king of Egypt, So, and there's actually an entire dynasty associated with that name if you want to look back at it. I can't remember how to spell it, but it's a very long dynasty name. And that king, he went to make a treaty with him that said, if you'll partner with me, I'll partner with you, and we'll kick Assyria out. Because why would Egypt want this land? It is the natural bridge for trade into Asia. You follow me? And what is Asia? Turkey. Remember all the development. And now keep in mind, we are looking, remember we said we were tracing the red thread at one point? What is the Bible? It's chasing that thread that leads to Jesus through the people, through the Jewish people. We are looking at this through a microcosm and through a filter of Jewish people. At that time, China still existed, and that's where I'm going with this, is that China at this time did exist. Rome did exist. There were other cultures. We just read the Bible and we go, oh, this is all that's going on. And it's like, no, man, there's a whole world going on around the Bible at this time. And we're just tracking down this one thread through Judaism. And so now what happens is this King Oshaya goes to the king of Egypt, king of Egypt, and he did not offer tribute any longer to the king of Assyria as he had done year after year for 9 years. So he gets essentially, it's the same thing that Rome did in the time of Jesus, that Rome did to Jerusalem, is that they said, if you pay us taxes, we'll let you alone pretty much and let you do what you do. Now, we'll have governors in place that are friendly to us, but you have to collect taxes from it, and we're going to make money from you. Taxes never go away, right? No matter what culture we live in. So here we are, that this king, Hoshea, has made this treaty with So, and Assyria's king hears about it. And when he hears about it, he gets heavily ticked off. So much so that he comes and he actually takes back control militaristically of the northern kingdom where Hoshea is operating. And he actually goes in and arrests Hoshea and puts him under house arrest. The image that you see lightly placed in the background in the top corner of the slide up here, that is an image of Hoshea. Okay, he's a big nose, kind of squirrely looking rascal, in my opinion. So the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser, went up in all the land, and he went up to Samaria where Hoshea is and besieged it. For 3 years he battled this king, Hoshea, and took over the land again. And in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he deported the Israelites to Assyria. You follow that? So all these tribes that have been operating in somewhat autonomy, but worshiping other gods, are now being broken by a Gentile pagan ruler. And God has removed his hand from the kingdom of Israel and said, I'll let them have their way with you again. You follow where we're at? And so in the 9th year, this happens. He placed in Halah, he placed them, the Israelite exiles that were being extracted from the northern kingdom, he placed them in Halah, in Habor, in the river of Gazan, and in the cities of Medi. He moves these people and he exiles them. Why do you do that as a conquering ruler? You breed their culture out. Do you follow me? It has been clearly documented that, for instance, that Muslim cultures have said, how will we take, in modern day times, our times that we live in right now, that Muslim cultures have said, how will we control Europe? We will breed them out. Okay? This is not a new tactic. This is something that has been around forever. And so we'll exile the people, we'll assimilate them into other cultures, they'll adopt those cultures, they'll forget their culture, and they'll become a part of the Assyrian Empire. Now look at this. Now this happened because the Israelites, verse 7, had sinned against Yahweh their God when he brought them up from the land of Egypt. What book is that from? Exodus, directly out of Exodus. He had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and they feared who? Other gods, other Elohim. And you're like, you gotta be kidding. This is like we went straight from Exodus and we thought we finally had it together. We got the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey and all this kind of stuff. And they go back to worshiping other gods. And it gets even worse. They walked in the statutes of the nations whom Yahweh had driven out before the Israelites. I don't know about y'all, but I hate reading this part. Because after we've invested so much of our time in Exodus, and you think, finally, they're getting out. And then you read this hundreds of years later, and you go, they didn't get it. They went straight back to the vomit, which the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things that were not right against Yahweh, their God. Can you do anything secretly against God? Nothing. Everything is laid bare. And that word is you're naked before God. You know, everything's laid bare. They built high places for themselves in all their towns. Do you know why the Tower of Babel was so insidious and so bad? Because mankind was creating a place to touch the heavens. Do you see the symbolism purposely that they could create a structure that they could go to and be as high as the Elohim? Do you see that? And so you see here, they begin to go to the high places, the mountains, and they create for themselves in all their towns, from the watchtowers up to the fortified cities. They create these places, these high towers. So they built these high places, and they're all over the country at this point. So we go on in verse 10. They set up for themselves stone pillars. What did they tear down when they went in and destroyed the kingdoms that God sent them after? Stone pillars, Asherah poles. They went to worship Asherah again on every high hill and under every green tree. This is not good. I want you to think back. When you think of, it's called etz, which are trees in the Bible. What is the primary tree? Kelly's been studying it, so I saw her grimace when she saw this, so don't answer out loud, Kelly. What is the primary tree that we are supposed to associate with in the garden? The tree of life. We're not supposed to go to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So trees in the God view, in the juxtaposition of the good tree and the bad tree, they should be going to the tree of life, yet what they are doing is they are going to the tree of evil. Does that make sense? This is really, really bad. Yes. Yes. Under a tree. Yes. They're trying to do that again. Do you see how bad this is? This is like a simple, simple verse. And if you're just reading along and you don't connect the dots, which are intended to be connected, this is not like Chad and Kelly are reaching. This is how the Bible is intentionally written, that we see this tree that they have come up against, and they burned incense there on all the high places. Where were the incense supposed to be burned? In the tabernacle. Like the nations which Yahweh deported before them, and they did evil things to provoke Yahweh. They didn't just do evil things just to do evil things. They did evil things to deliberately provoke the creator of the universe. That is evil, evil. You see how bad that is? They served idols of which Yahweh had said to them, "You shall not do this thing." He specifically said, don't serve these things. Yahweh warned Israel and Judah by the hand of his every prophet with every seer. Seer is another word for prophet, saying, "Turn from all your evil ways and keep my commandments and my ordinance, according to all the law which I commanded your ancestors, which I sent to you by the hand of my servants the prophet." Turn. This is not good. You need to move away from this. This is not what I intended for you. Y'all follow me? I would not look down upon these people, y'all. Is that modern day clear enough for you? We should not look down upon these people. This is very close to where we are as well. But they did not listen, and they stiffened their necks like the necks of their ancestors who did not believe in Yahweh their God. Y'all remember from Exodus when he talked about the stiff-necked people? I mean, y'all, you should be seeing like an overlay of Exodus as we move through here. They rejected his statutes. Whose statutes? God, Yahweh's statutes. His covenants which he made with their ancestors. Where? Where did he make these covenants? on Mount Sinai, and his warnings which he gave to them. And they went after the idols. They became vain and went after all the nations which were all around them, which Yahweh had commanded them to do as they did, not to do as they did. They abandoned all the commands of Yahweh, their God, every command, made for themselves 2 molten calves. Did we study that? And calf idols, and they made a pole of Asherah worship and bowed down to the army of the, look at this. They bowed down to the army of the heavens and served Baal. The cast out angels. That's exactly what it is. Somebody says, well, Ted, I don't understand. They're literally worshiping the host of heaven. Do you see how bad it's gotten since Exodus? Have y'all got in your mind for just a moment how bad it is in Israel? We are not far from it. They made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire. Do you know what that is? They sacrificed their children, literally, on the idols, on the hands of the idols. They literally sacrificed their children. Foster, go see Mom for a second. They practiced divination and they read omens. Do you know how divinations, have y'all ever learned about divination? I think we've talked briefly about it, but I want to make sure everybody's up to speed. These divinations and omens, this is where they would read the entrails of animals. So you would slaughter an animal and you would take that animal and you would spread its organs out and you would read the liver and all these kind of things to understand what God was trying to show you. Okay? Yes, Fred. These are the descendants of the ones that were led into the promised land, but many, many years, hundreds of years passed. Yes, that's right. This is not Jacob, or pardon, Joseph. Yes. Supposedly, if you knew how to read the entrails of an animal, you could look at the layers of fat that were on it and other things, and it would tell you sort of what you should do next. And then they had soothsayers and other oracles that would, underneath hypnotic trances, literally they would get gases from the earth, and it would put them into a drug-induced trance, and they would then speak on behalf of the demonic world or say whatever. And so these omens, and they sold themselves to evil in the eyes of Yahweh to provoke him. They deliberately did this in an effort to make Yahweh mad at them. So Yahweh was very angry with Israel, and he removed them from his presence. That's interesting. None remained except the tribe of Judah alone. Even Judah did not keep the commands of Yahweh their God, and they walked in the customs of Israel which they introduced. So Yahweh rejected all the offspring of Israel, speaking of the tribes, the whole tribes, and punished them, and he gave them into the hand of the plunderers, Shalmaneser of Assyria, until he banished them from his presence. Serious business here. God is literally moving these people out of his very presence. Do you see that? Do you see how desperate the situation is at this point? For he had torn Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. But Jeroboam detached Israel from following Yahweh, and he made them sin a great sin. So this is looking back in history and saying, this is from the line of David, this all started, and this ripple effect started, and it's traveled all the way forward to Hoshea. Y'all follow? He sort of did a replay of history there. The Israelites walked in all the sins of Jeroboam that he committed, and they did not depart from it until Yahweh removed Israel from his presence, as he had foretold by the hand of all his servants, the prophets. And so he deported Israel from upon his land to Assyria until this day that the book of 2 Kings was written. Y'all following? So it's bad news for Israel again. Remember how we said history repeats itself? History just repeated itself. Yes. Because they were so evil in the eyes of God, he separated them from him from the very land he gave them. That's pretty bold. That's a question. Real quick, show of hands. I had never studied this before until I had been studying Isaiah. Has anybody ever picked up on this before? This new to everybody, pretty much? Yeah, it's new. Yeah. So here God has removed these people and he's turned them over to this people. So what's next? The prophets. Thank God for prophets. What is a prophet, though? A prophet is really about one who speaks on behalf of someone else. Who's the prophet typically speaking of, though, as we see them in the Old Testament? Yes. There's an interplay there. And that's the reason I wanted you to think about it. Typically, we associate the job of a prophet to speak to the people on behalf of God. I'm sorry, what? Yes. Yes. And so now what we see is, and let's see if I can get audio here, and we're going to watch a short video on this.
Ezekiel, Obadiah, Habakkuk. What do these names have in common? Well, they're 3 of the 15.
If it wasn't for problems, we wouldn't have no problems at all.
Ezekiel, Obadiah, Habakkuk. What do these names have in common? Well, they're 3 of the 15 prophets that have their own books in the Bible.
And if you've tried to read these books, odds are you got lost in their dense poetry and strange imagery. But these books are super important for understanding the overall biblical story.
So let's talk about how to read the prophets. When I hear the word prophet, I think of a fortune teller, someone who predicts the future.
That's what being a prophet means in many cultures, but not in the Bible. While the biblical prophets sometimes speak about the future, they're way more than fortune tellers.
How should I think about them?
Well, they were Israelites who had a radical encounter with God's presence, and then were commissioned to go and speak on God's behalf.
Like a representative.
Right. And the thing they cared about the most is the mutual partnership that existed between God and the Israelites.
Right, the partnership. God rescued Israel from slavery in Egypt and invited them to become a nation of justice and generosity that would represent his character to the nations.
And so this partnership required all Israelites to give their trust and allegiance to their God alone. In the Bible, this partnership's called the covenant.
But the leaders, the priests, the kings, led Israel astray and they broke the covenant.
And so this is where the prophets came in, to remind Israel of their role in the partnership. And they did this in 3 ways. First, they were constantly accusing Israel for violating the terms of the covenant. The charges usually include idolatry, alliances with other nations and their gods, and allowing injustice towards the poor.
So like covenant lawyers.
Right. And so second, the prophets called the Israelites to repent, which means simply
Do what? I can. I want to try and get this though. It's really important for tonight. I'm sorry, y'all. See if it's maybe just a cable issue. It's like a magic trick. Watch this.
to turn around. They spoke of God's mercy to forgive them if they would just confess and change their ways.
But Israel and its leaders didn't change. Things went from bad to worse.
And so that brings us to the third way the prophets emphasized the covenant. They announced the consequences for breaking it, which they called the day of the Lord.
Oh yeah, the apocalypse. Visions of the end of the world.
Well, sort of. The prophets were mostly interested in how God would bring his justice on Israel's corruption and on the violent nations around them. And while explaining these local events, they often used...
Just keep plugging it in. Y'all ready? All right. All right, here we go. Oh.
Ezekiel, Obadiah, Habakkuk. What do these names have in common? Well, they're 3 of the 15 prophets that have their own books in the Bible.
And if you've tried to read these books, odds are you got lost in their dense poetry and strange imagery. But these books are super important for understanding the overall biblical story.
So let's talk about how to read the prophets. When I hear the word prophet, I think of a fortune teller, someone who predicts the future.
That's what being a prophet means in many cultures, but not in the Bible. While the biblical prophets sometimes speak about the future, they're way more than fortune tellers.
How should I think about them?
Well, they were Israelites who had a radical encounter with God's presence, and then were commissioned to go and speak on God's behalf.
Like a representative.
Right. And the thing that they cared about the most is the mutual partnership that existed between God and the Israelites.
Right, the partnership. God rescued Israel from slavery in Egypt and invited them to become a nation of justice and generosity that would represent his character to the nations.
And so this partnership required all Israelites to give their trust and allegiance to their God alone. In the Bible, this partnership's called the covenant.
But the leaders, the priests, the kings, led Israel astray and they broke the covenant.
And so this is where the prophets came in, to remind Israel of their role in the partnership. And they did this in 3 ways. First, they were constantly accusing Israel for violating the terms of the covenant. The charges usually include idolatry, alliances with other nations and their gods, and allowing injustice towards the poor.
So like covenant lawyers.
Right. And so second, the prophets called the Israelites to repent, which means simply to turn around. They spoke of God's mercy to forgive them if they would just confess and change their ways.
But Israel and its leaders didn't change. Things went from bad to worse.
And so that brings us to the third way the prophets emphasize the covenant. They announce the consequences for breaking it, which they call the day of the Lord.
Oh yeah, the apocalypse. Visions of the end of the world.
Well, sort of. The prophets were mostly interested in how God would bring his justice on Israel's corruption and on the violent nations around them. And while explaining these local events, they often used cosmic imagery.
Cosmic imagery?
Yeah, like Jeremiah. He described the exile of the Israelites to Babylon as the undoing of creation itself. The land dissolves into chaos and disorder, no light, no animals or people. Or Isaiah described the downfall of Babylon as the disintegration of the cosmos, stars falling from the sky, the sun going dark. For the prophets, when God acts in human history to bring justice, it's a day of the Lord.
So the prophets aren't talking about the end of the world.
Well, hold on. They're doing many things at once. The cosmic imagery shows how these important events of their day fit into the bigger story of God's mission to bring down every corrupt and violent nation once and for all. The prophets cared about the present and the future, and the cosmic imagery allowed them to talk about both at the same time.
Got it. So no matter when you live, the day of the Lord's bad news if you're part of Babylon.
But it's good news if you're waiting for God's kingdom. The day of the Lord pointed to the return of the exiles to Jerusalem, and once again, the prophets use cosmic poetry to describe it. They see a new Jerusalem, like a new Garden of Eden, with all humanity living at peace with each other and with the animals. And there's a new Messianic king who restores God's kingdom in a renewed creation.
Beautiful. So those are the 3 themes in the prophets. These prophets must have been very powerful, persuasive speakers.
Well, some were, but others lived on the margins. They would often perform strange symbolic stunts in public to communicate their message. Like when Ezekiel lay in the dirt and built a model of Jerusalem being attacked by Babylon. Or when Isaiah walked around naked for 3 years as a symbol of the humiliation of exile.
So do people pay attention to them?
Not really. The stories in these books show how the prophets were a minority group mostly shunned by Israel's leaders. And their writings were a kind of resistance literature. Most people ignored them, that is, until their warnings came true in the Babylonian exile.
And after that, people began to take their words seriously.
Yes, the works of these earlier prophets were inherited by later unnamed prophets who studied these texts intensely. They're the ones who arranged the Hebrew scriptures as we know them, including the books of the prophets.
Okay, and there's 15 books of the prophets. The big three are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel.
And then there's a collection of 12 smaller prophetic works unified on a single scroll. And in each of these books, you'll read stories about the prophets and their poems and visions, all arranged to show the cosmic meaning of Israel's history. How God would turn their tragic story of failure and exile
into a story of hope and restoration for all nations.
And it's that twin message of prophetic warning and of hope that the prophets cared about so much. And it's a message that we still need to hear today.
All right. So Isaiah, whenever you look at prophets, Isaiah actually had some contemporaries, and we oftentimes don't think about this when we think about the prophets with one another. Look at the time period of Isaiah here. Who was a contemporary of Isaiah? Micah. You see that? Hosea. These are all contemporaries. They lived at the exact same time. And I think that's fascinating because oftentimes whenever we study our Bible, we read through and we go, well, there's Isaiah and then there's Jeremiah and then there's this one. And it's like we get some reason in our mind, we think, oh, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. And now what we're seeing is that actually these prophets are connected to one another. And they're probably hearing from one another, not through Facebook, but through some other method. And so now all of a sudden we've got these connections going on between these men speaking on behalf of God. And what's interesting is that you see these men having a very similar message. And Tim Mackey and John Collins were talking about that in the video, is that all of the prophets were sort of calling back to the people saying, stop. If you'll just stop, God will redeem you. But they wouldn't. And so that's whenever we enter into now what we see is Isaiah's place in the history books. Because Isaiah became one of those, if you recall in the video, it said there were 3 primary scrolls, right? And then a bunch of the minor prophets were actually all on a single scroll. Have you thought about that before? When we think about our Bibles, we think about there's individual books in our Bible. And again, I want you to think about this is the library part of your Bible called the prophets. And like you would go to the Dewey Decimal System and you would pull these things out, that kind of thing. I don't think people know what the Dewey Decimal System is anymore. So but you go to Isaiah, now we're in Isaiah's place in history. And we begin to see Isaiah come about in about AD 739. You know, somewhere in that we see Isaiah, actually the ministry of Isaiah begin to form. And the reason we know this is that it is associated as well with this Tiglath-Pileser III. This is actually a relief that is carved out of stone in the top right corner there of this king. And so what's happened is we're past the time of Hoshea, okay? We've made it through those 9 years. They are in exile now. And now we're in the time period of Isaiah, and the king of Assyria and that we're dealing with is this Tiglath-Pileser III. And we've seen that over time what's happening is these groups are coming in 743 BC. This is, historically speaking, the Spartans were at war at this time. 300, the movie. It happened at the time of Isaiah. Isn't that kind of interesting to think about? Also, Assyria destroys the northern tribes of Israel, that whole time period that we're dealing with now. And the Greeks actually introduced vowels into the alphabet during the time of Isaiah. So all kinds of things are happening. I say all of this because I want you to get a scope of what's going on in the world, not just in this one little thread. And the only 2 tribes that are really left are the tribes of Benjamin and Judah, located in the southern kingdom. And we see the exile that goes out of this time period of Isaiah. We will see a fast forward into the exile time period of the 500, the early 500s, 598 through 539. And then in 539, we actually see the return of the Israelites back to the land after being exiled for over 200 years. You see that? Okay, so that's where I just want to get in your mind sort of what's going on and where we are in history. Anybody lost? Isaiah was a prophet to, yes, yes, to both. Yes, he's talking to these kingdoms that exist, okay? And we'll go into that a little bit as we move through the history of the book. So, and we're about to enter into Isaiah chapter 1. What we're dealing with in Isaiah is probably one of the most quoted books in the New Testament. So it is very important that we understand what's going on with Isaiah, because when Jesus speaks of it, if you don't know what was going on, you'll like get a translation of a translation of a translation. Does that make sense? And in our time period, we won't understand it properly because we haven't connected Isaiah to the history of what was going on. But now you have that in your mind. So when you read those quotes in the New Testament, it'll begin to make more sense to you why Jesus said what he said. So Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1. The prophet's name, remember, is Isaiah. What's Isaiah's last name? People don't have last names. Okay? They're the son of. That's how they're named here. The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz. Now you say, is this the only place in the book of Isaiah that we have Isaiah? No. Across the annals of time in Jewish history, we see Isaiah referenced. In 2 Kings, in Sam, and other books, you can actually go and find Isaiah, this same prophet, referenced, okay? And so Isaiah is in some place at this point, and he begins to have a vision. Is he smoking pot? What's going on? Did he eat bad pizza? What's happening? What kind of vision are we talking about here? No, we're talking about a heavenly vision that God invites Isaiah, much like we would say the Apostle John. And we see the vision of the book of Revelation. Would you call that a vision? Yes, that's what we're talking about, that kind of vision. The vision of Isaiah, son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, and kings of Judah. So he's in the southern kingdom primarily. Remember, we said the southern kingdom is made up of Judah and Benjamin, and their capital is Jerusalem. The northern kingdom is made up of primarily the other tribes, and that's where Samaria. Remember Samaria in the New Testament? When Jesus goes to visit the who at the well? The Samaritan woman at the well? That's the tribal separation, okay? So that Samaria is what we're looking at there. But he's in the southern kingdom right now, and he's working with these kings. And he says to them, hear heavens and listen earth. You see who he's talking to? Do you see what? The heavens are the rakia, remember? The dome. Who's in the heavens? The heavenly host. Who have the Israelites been worshiping falsely? The heavenly host. You see that? So who exactly is Isaiah talking to here? Have you ever thought about that for just a minute? We always, when we read the Bible, we typically think of the prophets and we look at it and we go, oh, the prophets were speaking to the people of Israel. Isaiah says, hear heavens and earth. The prophet is speaking into the spiritual world too. For Yahweh has spoken. Adonai is speaking to Judah. I reared children and I brought them up. This is the voice of Yahweh, Adonai. I reared children and I brought them up, but they rebelled against me. Do you, as people of Israel reading the book of 2 Kings, now know exactly how they reared their head against him? If you open the Bible and you turn directly to Isaiah and you read this, what would you know? Not the right story, right? That's the reason the story of Oshaya was so important, because it frames for you the very beginning of Isaiah. And we see, I reared you children, implying that when God brought them out of Egypt, he treated them like a mother treats children. Remember that imagery was in there as well, right? He brought them out and he brought them up. Brought them up from where? Egypt. But they rebelled against me in the very land I gave them. An ox knows its owner, and a donkey the manger of its master. Israel does not know, my people do not understand. Now, I want you to see those words. I want you to study in this way. I'm taking the time to show you this because as you begin to read your Bibles on your own, I want you to begin to take notice of this and slow down. So, an ox knows its owner is supposed to be laid against Israel does not know me. Do you see how the sentences are directly opposed to one another? And a donkey, the manger of its master. My people do not understand me. Do you see how that should like be poetic in your mind? It should paint a picture for you, and it was intended to do that to these Israelites. Does that make sense? Hey, yeah, it is. It's comparing you to barn animals. Smart as a donkey. Yeah, you're not a smart. Hey. Sinful nation, a people heavy with iniquity. Iniquity is sinfulness. It is vileness. Offspring of evildoers. You've read Hoshea, the king, 2 Kings 17. You have this background. Children who deal corruptly. With who do they deal corruptly? With Yahweh. They have forsaken Yahweh. They've dealt corruptly with him. When we read 2 Kings, we see that over again. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. Do you see that? Their attitudes, their behavior, their evil nature, they are estranged and gone backwards. Backwards to where? Think for a moment. Egypt. Yes. That's the idea, is that I brought you out of Egypt. And you spent a year with me at the base of Mount Sinai. And I taught you. And you heard the trumpets and you knew that Moses went on top and all these things. And you've gone backwards again. This is like an indictment for America, y'all. Y'all see that? This is like exactly where we are in history. You have gone back. This could be, we could just put our name. You have gone backwards, America. This would like be a really good patriotic sermon. So that's where we're going to end tonight, is in this verse.